Join me in my continued quest to find the greatest film ever made. Today we take a look at 1972. Welcome to my ranking for films I've seen from the year 1972. There are 10 of them in total. I'm really pleased about that. I think my big worry coming into this series is that I would stumble across a number of years where it turns out I've only seen 3 or 4 films or something. But so far we had 10 films in 1971. We've got 10 films for 1972. Some really even numbers just happening to get thrown up, and I hope it continues. The film which comes top today will qualify for the grand final further down the line. And the film which comes second may also qualify for the grand final, just depending on how many spots are available. I'm hoping to have 100 films for that final. Now, in terms of the films you're going to see today, there's a big gap in quality between the bottom 2 and the top 8. The bottom 2 are literally just here to make up the numbers. I've technically seen them, and technically they were released in 1972, but they are not films that I really like at all. You'll probably laugh when you see them, actually. But from 8 upwards, it gets a lot better. Right, let's get into it and find out then what is officially my 10th favourite film from 1972. Now, I must admit that when I started my channel, which is predominantly a horror channel as you all know, I did not envisage myself talking about Dumbo in any of my videos, and yet here we are. Now, I know what you're thinking, Dumbo came out in 1941. Yes, I know that, everybody knows that, but it was re-released in 1972, and I've decided to allow it to be in the competition for 2 reasons. Firstly, I really like the idea of having at least 10 films in every one of these lists. And secondly, I'm unlikely to go back and do a rankings video for films that came out in 1941, so this might be Dumbo's only chance to take part in the competition. So, using my referee's discretion, I've allowed it to enter, albeit it hasn't done very well. I watched Dumbo when I was a kid. Maybe once, maybe twice, I don't know, but the only bits I can remember, one of them is when the elephant's flying down out of the fire tower. That might be near the end, and I also remember a few scenes in a tent. That's about it, but I don't think even my own kids ever really watched this film. I couldn't even tell you if it's a boys' film or a girls' film. I mean, does anybody like this, really? There's a remake, I think, from quite recently, but won't be watching that either. So here we have the other naff film that I warned you about earlier. I'd still choose this over Dumbo though. In fact, I can remember watching The Sword in the Stone a few times when I was extremely young and quite enjoying it. I mean, I think it's got like Merlin in it and a few of those round table characters. It's another re-release. It came out in 1963 originally, and then I believe was re-released in 72 and then re-released again in 83. I'm not going to be allowing it to enter the 1983 competition though. Rules of the game: a film can only enter 1 rankings, whether as an original release or as a re-release. So there you go, Sword in the Stone comes at number 9. So here we have a proper film finally. The Poseidon Adventure is a disaster movie that I'm quite sure I watched a couple of times growing up. I want to say that I watched this at least once on a Saturday afternoon. It does feel like the sort of thing that kids would watch on a Saturday afternoon back in the 80s when I was growing up anyway. The scene that I remember the most is when Gene Hackman jumps on the wheel and then he falls off to his doom. That made me really sad. I've never seen the 2006 remake. I imagine that with the advancements in CGI that have been made today, that might be more palatable if you're coming to these movies and you've never seen any of them. But if you can tolerate old films and you do like disaster films, then I'd say give the 72 version a watch. It's still pretty decent. I watched a couple of clips on YouTube the other day just to remind me of some of the stuff that goes on in the movie. I believe this was the last ever Bruce Lee film. In fact, I think a lot of it might have been edited after he died. I only really remember it because of the pagoda scenes quite near the end. There are a couple of Bruce Lee films that I didn't allow into this ranking because I just couldn't remember them enough, even though I suspect I may have seen them. So the names of those would be Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon. Game of Death is decent from what I can remember from the one time that I saw it, but the two Bruce Lee films that I remember the most that I would say are my favourite of his are Big Boss and Enter the Dragon. I remember those a lot more distinctly. Tales from the Crypt is a horror anthology film that features 5 different short stories inside it, plus a wraparound. You won't need me to tell you whether you're into these sorts of films or not, but if you are, and you haven't seen some of these older ones that a company called Amicus did, then you should absolutely check them out. Tales from the Crypt is one of those. There are 7 of them in total. I've got all of them on Blu-ray. They're all really good. Tales from the Crypt is probably neither one of the best or one of the worst. I'd probably call it, one that would be in the middle of the pack when it comes to the Amicus horror anthologies. This particular one has a wraparound tale where these group of people walk into a crypt and it shuts behind them in a graveyard or something, and then we get the 5 tales. It's really good if you haven't seen it. So here we have the sequel to Shaft, Shaft's Big Score. In my 1971 rankings, I had the original Shaft film in 4th place. Both the first 2 films in this series are very, very good, very, very close in quality. I might just give the edge to the original Shaft. It was the 3rd film where they really dropped the ball with Shaft in Africa. Opinions may differ, but I really like this series. Watching Richard Roundtree as a cop walking around Harlem solving whatever mystery he's solving, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed these films growing up. What was that song they used to sing? Who's the coolest cat in town? Blah, blah, blah. Shaft. Right on, brother. Something like that. This is a film about 4 guys who, on their weekend off work, go to the woods for kayaking and adventuring, and then they get terrorized by hillbillies. I'm not sure if you'd call it a horror film necessarily. Somebody lent it to me about 10 years ago. That's the only time I've watched it. They said, you've got to watch this. It's an absolute classic. I think the thing which surprised me the most about the film is that it's so low-key. There's so little that develops in the final act. It's just kind of played really straight. There's no kind of twists or, villains coming out of the woodwork. I thought there'd be loads kicking off in the final third of the movie and nothing really happens, but that's not a criticism. Films like this are interesting that sort of tease you with the idea that this or that could happen and then nothing really does. It didn't really resonate with me as a film that much. I'd never really owned this one, I don't think, although I'd certainly be curious to watch it for a second time. It had a really good atmosphere. There's lots of really good performances in it. You can really tell that the actors are going through the mill when they're on that river. This is a film I reviewed fairly recently, actually. I was very positive towards it. I gave it 3.5 out of 5. I saw it originally back in the 90s when I was a teenager. I might have watched it a couple of times back then, actually. And more recently, I bought the Blu-ray, watched it again. I watched the commentary track on the Blu-ray as well. It's got Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee in it. It's sort of like a version of The Thing on a train. And if that doesn't grab you, I don't know what will. It's definitely worth watching this. And I found out from a streamer the other day that you can watch this for free on YouTube. Apparently, I didn't know that. So no excuses for not watching it. This is an absolutely classic gangster film. I've seen it maybe 4 or 5 times in my lifetime. I'm quite surprised I don't own it, actually. I think the reason why I don't is probably because it's always been readily available to watch on the UK version of cable. There's some great actors in this, though. Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, James Caan, Talia Shire's in it as well. It's about 3 hours long, but it never gets boring. Some people say that the second film is better. Every time there's a discussion about greatest ever sequel, there's always somebody who immediately chimes up, Godfather 2, but I think the first one is just a smidgen better. I just like that straight A to Z narrative, whereas the second one goes back and forth a little bit between the ages. I'm not saying that the second film isn't also a great film. They're both great films, but if you ask me to stick my neck out and pick one, I would say part 1, and obviously part 3 is some way behind both of the first 2. Now, by coming in second place on this ranking, The Godfather has guaranteed itself a playoff spot to possibly get into my grand final of 100 films further down the line. But for now, let's find out which film came just ahead of it to win the 1972 rankings. I think there's going to be a few people who are like, oh my God, you put that ahead of The Godfather, but just my opinions, just my opinions. So let's find out what that film is. Yep, Asylum is my number 1. It's another horror anthology film from Amicus. But it's not just any horror anthology film. In my opinion, it's the greatest horror anthology film of all time. You can take your trick-or-treats and your VHSs and all your more modern ones, but in my opinion, this is the best. This trumps all. It's got 4 great stories. It's also got a great wraparound story which just blends seamlessly in with the 4 tales in the middle. The first story in this, which features these body parts wrapped up in parcels and then they come to life. Oh God, that blew me away when I first watched it as a teenager. It was one of those moments where you realise you just love film and you will always love film. The second story's got Peter Cushing in it, that's a good one. Third one's got Britt Ekland in it, and the fourth one, there's no real famous actors in that one, I don't think, but that's the story where things start to blend in again with the story going on in the background, the main story. It's so clever how everything links together in Asylum, and it's got a great twist at the end. If you've never seen Asylum and you like horror anthology films, you really need to check it out. So that is my number 1 for 1972, but there is one more question I think I need to ask myself before I wrap up. Not really, nothing I'm going to lose sleep over. Anyway, I did write down the names of a few films from 1972 that I would be curious to see, I guess. So I've got down here Across 110th Street. That sounds like a Shaft type thing. Wasn't there a song in the film Jackie Brown that went something like Across 110th Street? Unless I'm completely remembering that wrong, but maybe that song comes from this film. I've also got written down Conquest for the Planet of the Apes. I think that's the 4th film in the original Planet of the Apes series. I've seen the first 3. I never moved on to watching 4 and 5, probably because they just weren't on TV, but I'd like to finish it off at some point. I'd like to do a complete rewatch, actually. I've also got down The Mechanic, starring Charles Bronson. It sounds like your typical Charles Bronson thriller that's peppered all over his CV, sort of like Death Wish. I like the Death Wish films, though, so I probably like The Mechanic. I've got written down The Getaway, starring Steve McQueen. I don't know much about that, but anything with Steve McQueen in it is usually good. And the film that I would probably like to watch the most on this list is one called Sleuth, starring Michael Kane. I read the synopsis of this and it sounds really cool. It's like a mystery film. I actually went on my streaming platforms the other night looking to possibly rent this, you know, a late entry into the rankings. But sadly, it's not available to rent, and even secondhand DVDs of Sleuth are quite pricey, so I decided to give it a miss this time. But yeah, I'd like to watch that one in the future, definitely. So a few films there that didn't make the list that I sort of regret, but I still think I had a good list of 10. So there we have it. Asylum is the winner. The Godfather also may end up going through to the final. I hope you enjoyed watching this. I'll be back soon with my 1973 rankings. I'm hoping to not leave it too long between these videos. I'm hoping to maybe go review ranking from now on, although it's not set in stone. But anyway, we'll see what happens. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.